So can we just do 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Does that work? I'm going to hand this out.
Well, good afternoon. I am very pleased to introduce to you today Brigadier General Bryan W. Wampler, U.S. Army retired, currently serves as the Executive Director of the Frontier Museum of the U.S. Army Foundation. Is that in Leavenworth, or where is that?
So our actual address is Olathe, but it will be on Fort Leavenworth outside the fence and outside the gates.
Wasn't sure where that was. He retired with more than 32 years of service in September of 2015. Began his Army career by enlisting as a combat engineer in the Kansas Army National Guard. He was commissioned through the Reserve Officer Training Corps program at Emporia State University. His career includes 3 deployments in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation Enduring Freedom. Brigadier General Wampler received a Bachelor of Science in Geography from Emporia State, a Bachelor of Science in Liberal Arts from the University of the State of New York, a Master of Science in Management from Baker University, and a Master of Strategic Studies from the U.S. Army War College. His military education includes the Armor Officer Basic and Advanced courses, the Combined Arms and Services Staff School, and Command and General Staff Officer course, the United States Army War College, and the Canadian Forces College, Advanced Joint Professional Military Education, and Capstone. Wow, that's a lot to remember. He currently serves as the chapter president of the Greater Kansas City chapter of the Association of the United States Army, immediate past chair of the Command and General Staff College Foundation, is the Kansas Society president of the Sons of the American Revolution, and is an officer on the Kansas 250th Commission. Wow, that's impressive. So welcome, and we'll turn it over to you.
Well, it's good to be here. And my actual service was 32 years, 4 months, and 6 days. And the only reason I know that is when you retire, they put it on your retirement memo. Now, something that affects my family more than me, they also put in their amount of deployment time, which was, or time that you were deployed, not necessarily in a combat zone, but away from the family, which is 6 years, 11 months. I think it was 7 days, which really attests to the family, and then, me not being here. So often military members are gone. But I'm excited to be here today, and I promise you this is not going to be the standard leadership type discussion that you've heard so many times about. Is leadership innate or is it learned? And for us, it doesn't matter. In fact, I don't think it matters for anyone, because you have to continually train and educate yourself to be a good leader in any situation. But here are the topics we're going to talk about. I apologize for the animation. I keep trying to figure out how to turn it off. There's one point, it's really, so right there, that'd be a good one.
This plate is cats or something.
So yes. So here are kind of the topics we're going to talk about. So the leadership I'm going to talk about is, I believe everybody here is retired to an extent, and we're at a different point in our leadership careers and our lives, and leadership changes. When we're right in the middle of it, where we're in our career, we're working hard, we feel like we finally figured it out, and then we figure it out and everything changes. But the emeritus community is such a valuable resource that is, in my view, untapped. I have a great friend, some of you may know Gene Wilson, but I think Gene really has it figured out. He engages and he'll send you articles, he'll print out articles. I've talked him into, hey, Gene, download them and send them to me. But just amazing leader. And we'll talk about some of the leadership. And then we'll also talk about history. Do we have any history professors? Oh, excellent. Okay.
That may not help, though.
It does. In my opinion, we'll talk it more, everything repeats, without exception. I believe there should be a cabinet position for the national historian.
Talk to Elon.
So
He won't listen to it anyway.
you never know if you keep bringing it up. So, and control. And also control and change, and we'll get into that. So, here's the focus. So, this isn't directed towards profit or not for profit, for a staff position or a board position, for a volunteer organization. I believe it's universal, and if you have specific questions, I hope you raise them, because everybody in this room and everybody online, I think we have some folks online,
Maybe a few, yeah.
have different experiences and are encountering different opportunities, as I like to call them now, whether it's a volunteer organization, a paid position, a non-paid position, a board position. And then we might also talk a little bit, many of us who are on boards and many of our colleagues that join boards don't realize the fiduciary responsibility and the trust responsibility that comes with being on a board. I love the book that talks about Enron, and it really, now that was a paid board, but it really helps lay out exactly what board members' responsibilities are compared to a staff. Do we have any attorneys in here? Any attorneys online?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay, that's not a good thing, it's
I'm a
not a bad
legal
thing.
historian, does that
Oh,
count?
that works, we'll use that, so. Here are the topics we're gonna discuss. So, I'm really big into reference materials. Some people don't like bureaucracies. I love bureaucracies, because for me, and United States Army, federal government, the largest bureaucracy in the world, for me, bureaucracy is a great word, because I look at it as everything's written out how to get things done. You have the process. If someone tells you, oh, you can't do that, well, unfortunately, it says right here, we can. And I've always leveraged that. So I'm a person that likes techniques and processes that are associated with bureaucracies. But reference materials, you'll see in here, so you heard that I'm a geographer, and I had to start off with a geography reference, topophilia. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with that, but that's just how the environment someone comes up in affects the person or the culture. And on our walk-in today, Paul and I were talking about youth of today and how they're different. And I love that conversation, and I just ask all of us to hearken back when we were young. You young whippersnappers, I think was the term when I was growing up, just don't understand. I think it's history, it recurs. And for me, I think it's really important and incumbent upon us to understand the youth versus the other way around, and try to figure out how we can communicate. And my most recent experience, I was asked to be the guest speaker for the Junior Army ROTC department of Truman High School, and I forget the other two high schools. So 240 at a ball, and you know, I really looked at it and I was amazed. I felt that my presentation was kind of basic, generic, but from their feedback, they loved it. So I feel that I was able to connect, and it was hard. It was uncomfortable, but it worked. So I've talked about that. I'm going to continue to live it, but it's challenging. But I think it's important for us to pass along. And then also, something I like to say about resources, and some of these you may recognize. These are some of my go-to. Board Source, I love Board Source. I love Harvard Business Review. Overpriced, but I really like it. But it's interesting how little certain groups read today, have references and going back. Throughout my career, and I learned this from somebody who was senior to me, I used to take the Field Artillery Journal, and they would have exercises and things and have after-action reviews basically written in a magazine. And I'd have a little hanging file plastic case that I would throw in the back of the quarter ton when we had those, Humvee. So I'd have a reference. Go and look. Not use it as a check sheet or anything like that, although check sheets aren't bad. Some people don't like check sheets, but we already know I like bureaucracy, so I like processes. But there's nothing wrong with resources. Now, historians sometimes will say, well, some books aren't great. Now, I don't want to besmirch any book, but we all know Good to Great. It was a snapshot in time versus historic view, and that often comes up. So, any other references you all like that are probably honored up here. I saw two really good ones back there. One, a history of artists, reporters, and another group, so. So, a warm-up exercise. So what's the one topic nobody should talk about? Okay, so. I totally agree. So guess what? We're going to talk about politics. So this is a warm-up exercise. So just real quick, we need 3-person groups. So can we just do 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Does that work? I'm going to hand this out. And you only get.
I think, yes, I think the 3 of us.
You want 3 of you? So you only get 3 minutes. Who will be able to do this? So the list that I just handed out, the list I will turn to here in a second, is the complete list of presidential winners and losers, beginning with President George Washington through 1940 with President Franklin D. Roosevelt. So you're tasked within 3 minutes, and then you'll pick somebody and you'll report back, and you'll get 1 minute to say who you select, and who is going to be the scribe, and the scribe will write down each group. So go through the list. You can use your phone. Remember, you have 3 minutes. Pick the most important presidential race in history between 1789 and 1940, and why. So on your mark, get set. Any questions? Go.
Maybe the very first one.
Yeah, it looks like it. You know,
That was
John Adams, Thomas Jefferson.
I just read a book about one president that I like, James Garfield. He didn't want to be a president. The only problem was he got shot, and then the medical people tried to use their fingers to get the bullet out, and they killed him that way. It's Destiny of a Republic, one of my local authors in the city has written that one.
But Winfield and Hancock did not go on to be influential afterwards.
No.
And that's, I think that's part of what he's talking about here with leadership.
I would say Franklin D. Roosevelt, because he
You
basically.
mean Hoover and the first one with Hoover, rather than with Landon.
Yes, because that one turned the country around.
Yes, absolutely.
From-
And also Herbert Hoover went on to be important, even though he was out of favor politically. Do you see what I mean? He went on to do major work for the country, even though he was not in office of the government.
1
Do you see
minute.
what I mean?
Yeah, but we're talking about which election.
Which is the most decisive election. And to me, it's Washington over Adams. Because Washington set the tone that last, he's our ideal. And we still, even if we don't live up to it, we have that ideal.
Well, from that standpoint, though, the Jefferson-Adams 1800 would be a better matchup. You see what I mean? Because George Washington was a unicorn. And Jefferson and Adams were opponents.
You mean when
politically.
Jefferson won, or you mean
You see what I
1800?
mean?
Yeah, but Jefferson, although his importance with moving things west is not necessarily for ideal-wise the type of example you want to see for the country.
So you think it would be better to do Roosevelt?
I think so.
All right, probably good time to start locking in your selections.
What about Lincoln? Yeah.
Because that's pretty decisive. Could Breckinridge have won Civil War in the
No,
North?
but that's
And remember, one
getting into the swamp
spokesperson for
thing.
each group.
You know.
Okay, I still hear voices.
All right. Which group would like to go first? Well, since you volunteered me to be here, so.
There you go.
Yeah. So who did you select?
Andrew Jackson,
And what year?
the first, when he was running against Quincy,
What, and year?
1828,
And his opponent?
John Quincy Adams.
And why?
Because he was the first populist president to run. He ran a highly negative, highly contentious, highly disinformation-based campaign against Adams as an aristocrat who didn't understand the common people. And his intentions were to enhance and expand the enslavement of black people, and he was also responsible for the Indian Removals Act, so he was responsible for the removal of indigenous peoples from the eastern coast and the eastern states to the west. So he really was the architect of a lot of the populist, the right-wing populist movements that exist to this day. And he has been the touchstone, frankly, I think, for every, if we're going to be political about this, evil populist I've ever read about.
History repeats. History repeats. All right, thank you. Next group.
You guys.
So we chose the 1860 election where Abraham Lincoln beat John Breckinridge. It was, Lincoln had the skills to be able to do what needed to be done with our country going into civil war. He had made sure he had a cabinet that challenged him so that he would not just listen to people that agreed with him. And if not for Abraham Lincoln, we might be two different countries.
You guys.
Thank you.
We actually did not come to a
Oh,
consensus.
You have to.
You have to pick one.
If you concede, I was the one that would say Roosevelt is the one,
Which Roosevelt?
Franklin D. Roosevelt,
Which year?
in 32,
32.
because he changed the possibility of the country from an isolationistic and old thinking to a worldwide thinking. It took some time, and especially the social class fights that he had to carry on.
But to override him,
Go ahead.
I agree that this was an important moment, and I think what makes it interesting is that Hoover went on to spend the rest of his life doing really good things for America, even though he was not part of the Roosevelt group.
And even though he was a wretched president.
History repeats itself. Many would say the same about
Jane-
President Carter.
Yeah, absolutely.
So-
Exactly, it's the same situation.
Yes.
Well, I think the real tragedy in our history was James Garfield having a bad doctor. Because Garfield showed tremendous promise in terms of racial
Yes,
justice.
he sure did.
And I think had he lived, Reconstruction might have been a bit different. And today, I don't know, it's hard to tell about.
You mean Lincoln? Or you-
No,
if
Garfield.
Okay.
If Garfield had lived.
And that's what Jacob tried to convince us of.
He died,
Oh.
what, 6 days after he was?
No, he got
Assassinated.
shot.
Oh, he
Shot.
was assassinated.
And then the medical doctors, with their fingers trying to find the bullet, killed him.
Yeah, he had a terrible
Yep.
doctor, and had he lived, he was already engaged and showing promise in terms of racial things. And I think he could have made a difference in terms of.
Plus, he was one of the few that didn't want to be president.
Right, following the Benedictine rule.
There's a very
You
good
never
book
become
on,
an abbot if you, unless you don't want to be abbot.
there's a very good book on his death, written by a lady from Kansas City, who's done 3 rather good.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the right,
It's called Destiny of a Republic.
Okay.
I prefer assassination location.
So the correct answer is there's really no correct answer in this exercise. And some of you may have done this before. A few different viewpoints came out of this discussion, which is good. And you'd think from a group of college professors that you would. So when I first did this exercise, my thought was President Wilson. And for some of the same reasons that you all brought up, because he predicted almost to the year World War II if reconstruction, you know, if we took the path that we ended up taking when he passed away. Others talk about the very first election. I think I heard it over here, where President Washington said, "I'm done." He could have stayed as long as he wanted.
Yeah.
And I mentioned earlier, I love the artwork here. And I also love the artwork when President Washington is, or excuse me, General Washington is resigning his commission or his position. And the leadership is sitting down and he's standing up, showing that he is subservient to them. And a lot of people don't know the history behind that painting, but I think that's very important. Others talk about the campaign against John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Two men that ended up being great friends, despised, hated each other. Now, they transitioned power, and that's what was the important lesson here. Although we know what happened behind the scenes the next 4 years, so President Jefferson could win. But there's so many great examples throughout history. We stop at 1940 because the more current political history sometimes gets emotional, and that's why the topic of politics is verboten sometimes, but that's why I like doing this exercise. You know, professionals can have great conversation, intellectual conversations, and then what's great about this, especially with younger folks, and that's why we say use your smartphones, because unfortunately, history is not given much time in school. But then you look at it, if we just, so this is the 250th anniversary of the United States of America. What gets taught and what doesn't? How much time? And it's a challenge. It's just like undergrad. And we've heard well the current discussions about going to college, what you study. You know, should you be going to college to get a job or be a well-rounded person that learns how to think and act? So, any other comments on the exercise?
That was fun. Thank you.
Was it good? Has anybody done that one before?
Not
No.
with this,
Not this one.
not with this particular
Yep.
list, but yes, with others.
I hope you try to use it sometimes. And if you have a group that you really want to fire up, you can do the last 20 years or the last 20 presidents. So, yeah. So, but it's interesting. History repeats without question. So, personal traits and leadership. Like I said, I promise I'm not going to talk about the basics. So, and it's really interesting. The leadership traits, they have different definitions of traits, and that's why you see trait italicized. It's kind of like values and goals. So I value Diet 7-Up. I can't drink it anymore, but, and some people say, well, I value versus a principle you live by. So traits are interesting. So it's also very interesting, we have the generation differences and the gaps. And something I've been experiencing quite a bit lately, every organization talks about attracting youth in their ranks. And I'm sure everybody belonged to some type of society organization. And you heard I'm with the Sons of the American Revolution, the Association of the United States Army. And everybody wants to recruit youth, but when the youth join, the first engagement they have is, well, you millennials are you used to getting everything handed to you, receiving a trophy. And I love it when, like, our daughters, I have a 23 and a 26-year-old, and they got confronted, and I'm sorry, but I'm not a millennial. And then another gentleman said, well, it's not our fault we received trophies. You were the ones that were forcing the trophies on us. So rather than being opening and embracing, they sometimes push away. And for me, that's a very important leadership trait, is understanding how you engage with somebody that's maybe 40 years your junior, and how you respect them so they can respect you. Now, I'm sure, I remember when I was a young guy, Well, when I was a second lieutenant, I was sitting in a classroom and the battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Bob Barker, got up in front of us, and you know what the first thing in my mind was? Man, he's an old guy. So he started talking. By the end, he started really developing. Now, he had my respect from the beginning, but he really started earning my respect because he was giving information that was going to help me understand him and how I could go out and execute and support the folks I was leading so we could accomplish the mission. Now, 15 years, 12 years after that, whatever it was, I remember I was the battalion commander and I was talking and I looked at the second lieutenant and I just froze for a second. And I shared with him, or the whole group, that perspective of when I was the second lieutenant versus the lieutenant colonel. And I always wondered, did I look that old to him? And I'm sure I did. We all do. But I think it's upon us, on the leadership, to figure out how we can connect. And we're in a great position in organizations, groups, or wherever we find ourselves to connect and help guide, mentor, and coach so they can be successful. And it's not always, and sometimes it's figuring out what their specific approach is. What's the best way to support them or develop the connection? So, any thoughts on that? None? I'm sure there are. So we'll keep talking, and then
There's like
Too many.
too many
Yeah.
swing thoughts going on right now. So one of the things about being an educator, as you know, because you are 22, is that if we can't make connections with our students who are anywhere from 20 to 40 years, or sometimes less if we're in the beginning of our careers, but by the time we get to the old fart category, we have to make those connections with the students or we lose them. And you have to be empathetic with what's going on in their lives or you lose them. And even if that was not the experience we had decades ago with our own professors, the world has changed, I think, in terms of how we interact with people. And so I think it's always a juggle because you have, there are so many moving parts, especially these days. The world is so complicated and our students live such complicated lives, ones that we didn't have to deal with when we were college kids. And so I think that that's just part of the deal.
I agree. And some of the things that they do will drive us crazy.
Oh, yeah.
But it's up to us to figure out how we can come to that common ground to work towards success. And really setting them up for success, to be as successful as all of you have been in your lives. And so an example, you talk about empathy. That's my biggest weakness. I can go into an organization, I can see all the problems, I can align everything and work towards it. But my shortcoming is I sometimes don't pick up on people when they're too close. Now, folks off at a distance, it's easy to see. If they don't work directly for you around you, it's easy to see, but once people getting close. So that's something I have to look out for. And I used to always try to bring people along in different assignments. And you find those folks that are really good at identifying things and they can tell you different things. And then the certain things. I love people that can stand on their own 2 feet. And what I mean by that is you can give them an assignment and they execute. Now they can come back and say, I'm not sure about this, and this. How would you do that? Or they give you, and then you give them some advice, but I always warn them, if you bring a problem to me and ask me, please be sure that you really want the answer because I will give you the answer. So, and then sometimes you need to step in and help guide, coach, and mentor. Sometimes you need to let them go when you can. But it's very interesting. I love resilient people. There are certain things that bother me, and I'll share some, and you may have some. It really drives me nuts when someone goes, I'm confused. basically, and to me, that from a very early age, when someone says, I'm confused, it's, you really confused me. You know, or you are giving guides or whatever it is. Sometimes it's not. So I have to step back just a second, think to myself, listen to understand, not to react. Or when somebody says, well, what the general's really trying to say. No, what I was really trying to say is exactly what I said. Now, I might not have said it the best way, so let me say it again, versus that. So it's back to the beginning. I believe it's very important as leaders, whatever phase of our lives and careers, to really support, guide, coach, and help folks that we interact with. So, any comments before we move to the next? Hearing none. Does anybody disagree with anything?
I had when you said confused, my first response was, when you say, I'm confused, that I haven't thought about what you told me, not put any thought in, I just put as a response, say, I'm confused, please tell me again, so that maybe it's easy for me and you can tell me again what you wanted.
I love it when people put that second part on it, but for some reason, I'm confused.
Yeah.
It's like, Bryan, you're doing a very poor job of telling me what to do. And I developed that when I was 5 and 6 years old. That, which is interesting, and I can still remember the conversation with a friend of mine, Paul Majette, who first said I was confused. So, innate or learned, different discussion, but you never know. But thanks for mentioning that. So, history. It drives my wife crazy. In fact, if you want to ask her, if I always talk about everything repeats. Everything, whether it's political elections, business, it always repeats. We've had some great case studies here in the Kansas City area with businesses that we can look at. Of course, we've seen military actions across the world, across history. In fact, I was pleased to see quite a few military books in the bookcase right back there. But what I like to do is, so the powers of government. In the military, we use the acronym DIME. The Army is great at acronyms. In fact, I always share a story. Within the first hour of my first deployment to Iraq, I was in a briefing. And we put up a PowerPoint slide, first line, 7 words, 5 of them were acronyms. And I had never seen any acronyms before. So, and I just bring that up. I also like to have a rule that you can't use acronyms in a slide that you don't first spell out. And sometimes, if you have a break, you have to start over. So, acronyms. But DIME, diplomatic power, information power, military power, and economic power. So DIME. And the reason I bring that up is the historical connection. You can look throughout, you can go back to the Roman Empire, and that's a great place to start. And you look at the 4 elements of power and how things that happened back then happen today. If you look at schools, budgeting, curriculum, demand, the same thing. Some of the problems the universities are having today, they were having back in the Depression and before. So, any comments on history? Any vignettes?
One of my favorite statements, which is attributed to Mark Twain but probably wasn't, is history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it certainly does rhyme.
Yeah.
Situations do change, but you get patterns that repeat.
No, I totally agree. And going back to politics, it's also interesting how some individuals will say, this candidate is just like this really bad person. Which they're right, but they're looking at the wrong time frame. rather than looking at when the person was in power, back up and see how that person was able to gain power. Because what they try to do is the same thing, and they don't realize we're bolstering that individual versus trying to bolster somebody else. So that's why I think at the national and the state levels, there should be a historian on each cabinet with the staff. You know, we always have Homeland Defense, we have the Department of Defense, or the Adjutant General's Department at the states. I would love to see historians. And I'm amazed when people talk about historians or librarians or other those fields where they say, you can't get a job with that, don't go into that. And it's just the opposite. You just have to find the right place or the right circumstance. It's kind of like writing and ChatGPT, spell check, and those things. I personally feel it's very important to be a good writer and being able to communicate. ChatGPT is interesting. I don't like what it does to mine. I've tried. But there's going to be a time where it becomes a paid service versus a free service, in my opinion. So, but history, I'm sure all of you will think later this afternoon of different situations about history repeating. So, in the ballet world, you can look at that. It's very interesting.
Well, I think interesting too, when we talk about what is history. So I grew up in the state of New Mexico. I am pretty sure that most of the presidents in my lifetime really never learned anything about the history of the American Southwest. And what I find interesting now is our current president has said that the national language of the United States is English. Well, the state constitution of New Mexico is now in legal jeopardy because they have two official languages, English and Spanish. And when you look at the history of New Mexico, it's easy to see why Spanish would be an official language. So, you know, having a history person for states that could then communicate to the federal government or to other state governments, just so you have an idea of where, I mean, the culture of a state is different depending upon what part of the state, United States you're part of. And we only learn about New England, 13 colonies, and maybe a little bit about the gold rush. But I mean, we don't learn the history of the United States in all aspects unless you're actually in a particular state.
Yeah, where they have the requirement. I think UMKC or the University of Missouri system requires Missouri history in
You
order
have
to
to take a
graduate.
course on the Constitution. You have to learn about the Constitution, so that's why our American History Survey does well, because it counts for that, although I doubt that anybody teaching the American History Survey does a lot on the Constitution.
And that was in the Kansas City Star a while back. So,
It's high school graduation requirements that required
Okay.
Missouri State history. Same thing in Indiana, actually.
Kansas is, if I remember right, it was middle school, 7th grade. So, but you're absolutely right. And it's interesting if we look at history and languages. So my family came in 1751, or the first line, and they spoke German until the Revolutionary War. And that's when the church minister said, we need to start speaking English. And you see the records change from German to English. And then World War I, the German-speaking immigrants wanted to make sure that, hey, we're Americans. And they stopped speaking German and passing that along, which is a clear disadvantage. And if you look at kids growing up overseas, 3-4 language sometimes, and I never had opportunity throughout my education to take a language. So.
Well, I think the big shame is that they quit teaching civics,
Oh,
because nobody knows them. They don't understand the American government. They vote, I think, ignorantly or incorrectly, and I'm saying that on both sides, or whatever your political thoughts are. 'Cause they just don't understand.
Don't we have 5 parties right now?
What?
We have 5 parties, so,
Officially?
yeah. But yeah, I'm sorry.
No, but
I agree.
I just think it's a shame. grew up learning about the government, and I understood it, I thought, but I don't think today's children, this generation understands the Constitution or what the government is. And I think that's a shame.
And they're not the ones doing it. We're the ones that are dictating what is the curriculum,
Well,
what's
that's in
available.
some ways true, yes.
That's what's, I will tell you, I for the most part, so our daughters came up through the Shawnee Mission School District, so I'm familiar with that. When they go to school, it's almost like going to college. They have their groups, but they can pick the areas they want to go with the basics that they have to have. And I know I'm not using the right terminology on the basics. I think it's core curriculum, core requirements. So it's really interesting. It's just so often outside influencers will tell them, oh, you don't want to take that. You can't get a job with that. Oh, that there's no money in the arts.
Yeah, I get very tired of hearing that, particularly
Right.
from a certain leader of our university
So,
or
and,
campus.
yeah, you can read, what Emporia State has done, one of the schools that I
Oh,
graduated
God,
from.
yes, that was awful.
So, but it's not on them, it's on us. And what we can do through positive leadership when we engage in different organizations. So you heard Sons of the American Revolution. Some of you may be optimists. There are so many different organizations that interact with youth to help supplement those other areas. Because you just think about artists, potential politicians, historians that are out there who never have the opportunity to ever be exposed. And if they could be exposed once, they have another Mark Twain or Joyce, Diamato? DiDonato. You just never know. And I'm using the arts mainly because of my family. Now, sports, that's a different thing. Yeah, I came up through that athletic side, and there's always an encouragement there. And I think the lowest job opportunity in any field is probably professional athlete. Now, there are other supporting roles, but history repeats itself. So control. Whoops, did we miss something?
He's just saying the most competitive job in the world, in the West, is female ballet dancer.
So, and let's talk about that a little bit. So, how many are involved with the arts? So, in my exposure to the arts, well, I played the trumpet and then the tuba a little bit in high school. But my oldest daughter is a vocal performer, youngest daughter is a dancer. Their student to faculty ratio at a minimum was 1-on-1 at times. So singer. So it was 2-to-1. A pianist, the professor, and the singer standing in front of them, or the same with the performer. And if you want to hire somebody that can handle pressure, I think if you look at those types of performers or those types of individuals, dancers, they're always being looked at, always being corrected. I would call it criticized at times, but it's just non-stop, which you think, well, how does dancing help you in a career? You look at the folks that are in high pressure that need to be able to think when they're working and not just kind of melt down or saying, oh, I need a break. In fact, I have a friend who is the associate dean for a prominent medical school, and every application they receive, they have highest honors, perfect grades, all the sciences, and what they've been looking for are the extracurricular, music, choir, orchestra, band, as far as the music, the different things, because they have a tendency to do better going through, they say, than those that have just focused on it.
True.
So it's really interesting. So anything else? So I'll let you just glance at this slide a little bit because this is a fun one. So control. And it's really, and this is very prevalent in the conversation in the business world right now. And where it's popping up is being in the office and working in the office versus working remotely as an example. And I'm not sure if any of you have had to deal with that. So control. So often you hear, we have to have that person in the office so we can make sure they're working. Well, you have to look at the individual, because some people do better. I personally, you can put, and I work remotely now, and I work remotely. I'm an introvert. A lot of people think I'm an extrovert, but I'm a trained extrovert. I'm happy as a lark being able to work in my office, doors closed, and not being interrupted, and just being able to crank things out. To where my oldest daughter is a true extrovert. She works remotely, and I think it's killing her because she feeds, and she's one of those people that need to be around. And we probably have 50-50 in here or 60-40, but it's really identifying the individual. Now, if you have somebody at the office, another quandary, so all of us coming up, we remember personal phone calls. How many, sometimes you could have one a day, it would actually be listed to have a phone call or a family member. Today, the challenge is everybody has a smartphone. And the amount of time you're on your phone versus actually working. And it's interesting how that's popping up in government. County government is where I've seen it recently. But just levels of control, what works best. And that's why I like to talk about situational leadership, is identifying the traits of the individuals that work for you or that you're leading, and also your traits, what you need and like, and what your subordinates or your peers or the folks you're working with or the other volunteers like and need. It's like an organization, Kiwanis. Some people just want to be a member and know they're a member and support and pay, but they don't want to come to all the events and do everything. Where others want to come and they want to be able to interact with friends and colleagues, have a program, have some cookies, and then go home. And then there are others that really want to be in the leadership positions, so-called leadership positions. It's great when you find a secretary, and someone will be a secretary, right? Treasurer, it's great when you have somebody that's trained and the responses, but you have the different groups of individuals and what they're looking for, and as leaders of an organization, identifying those individuals and sometimes encouraging them. Because sometimes they want to do it and they just don't realize they want to do it until they get into those positions. So, any thoughts on that? Any examples of experience?
If I look here at the Emeritus College, we have all three groups very extensively represented. We have a core group, which you need to get them on the board, and then they do fine, but otherwise they kind of disappear. You have people that participate like in meetings like this, and that's fine for them. And then you have people that pay their dues, and that's basically it.
And we need them all. And it's working with them and finding what they need. So.
I was thinking about your comment about the phones.
Mm-hmm.
Now people are using their phones for their work stuff too, even though they might have a phone on their desk.
Mm-hmm.
But kind of figuring out how to balance that as a leader is tough.
It really is. Especially in the environment where there's a formal complaint process. Mm-hmm. Leader tries to do what's right, and if you look back at my reference slide, can't believe I'm forgetting the cost of leadership. Mm-hmm. How it can hurt you, or how it can affect you to be a good leader and doing the right things. So, but it is. In fact, the person I'm working with now, who's in county government, she's towing the rope and she's having to work through that, and it's hard. And then it's also very hard when you have on the legal thing, we were talking about attorneys, and when we were talking a little bit about the fiduciary responsibility and trust. As soon as you're at work in certain jobs and you use your phone, it becomes discoverable. the record. So, and I'm sure we've all experienced what's considered in writing. So, and I think there's plenty of court cases now where in writing text messages are admissible, emails are admissible. So, understanding those requirements. Now, in a volunteer situation, we might not be in that, but the Emeritus College, as far as being a formal part of the university, you have to deal with that. So, but
More an informal part of the university.
well, it's informal until somebody makes it formal.
Exactly.
It's so.
It's very formal.
Yeah. And that's why the leadership and understanding your responsibilities in any organization is so critical, because we've seen in the news to where all it takes is one case or one person to file a case or a complaint, and then the organization is kind of shaken at the roots. Is that the right saying? I love metaphors and sayings. One of the master mangled metaphors. So, but yeah. I didn't hear that completely, but
It only takes one person for the shit to start hitting the fan.
there you go.
She translated.
Yes. So, yeah, what Bryan was really trying to say. So, and then the pandemic. So much of the conversation has been how we've heard our kids. They were at school remotely, things like that. I would say we gave them some tools they didn't have before, because now they're extremely comfortable with the video teleconferencing. They're able to get things done. And I kind of started thinking about it. So when we were in Iraq, we were taking severe casualties by moving around to have conferences. So we started using the Tambergs, which were video teleconferencing. In fact, I had one on my desk and it was on all the time. And there were 7 of us, and we would all have it muted but the sound on, and when we had something, we'd unmute, start talking. And it was a new learned behavior for us. Video teleconferencing back then, we had the TVs. Now I was exposed to it prior to, but it was a new thing for most people. But then we had the 2 televisions, you might remember, and you'd have the big one, eye monster in the middle or on top of one. You'd see other folks on one, or the face, and you'd have the presentation on the other side. To where today, I don't know about you, but I have conferences on my phone all the time when I'm out and about or get pulled in. And you look at the youth and the skill they have, and part of it is from that. And the reason I bring that up is, even when there's a shortcoming in one area, there's a growth in another area that we need to identify, recognize, and exploit. You can also ask my wife. I always say never let a tragedy go unexploited or a controversy go unexploited. So, kind of like the pandemic. But I think our world has changed due to the pandemic.
Oh, no doubt.
Yeah, and it's just embracing it and figuring out how we can exploit that, utilize it, and exploit may be the wrong adverb or adjective, however you want to use it, but take advantage of the skills. So, well, any other thoughts about control, perception of control?
Well, I found it interesting, having taught before the pandemic and then after the pandemic, and how my class changed. So I was teaching in the pharmacy school, and the pharmacy school campus here, campus in Springfield, campus in Columbia, and so I'm sitting in a classroom in Kansas City, and I'm seeing people in Columbia and Springfield. And the pharmacy school decided in 2020, fall 2020, that the experience we had in the spring of 2020, their students were not attending class online, so they decided that their first year students, everything would be in person. So I'm teaching to people in 3 different cities in 8 different rooms. And the camaraderie that I had experienced before was lacking. I mean, they were sitting 6 feet apart from each other. And then they all got used to in subsequent years, it was like they thought, well, since everything is being recorded, I don't have to come to class. It was an 8 o'clock class. No one wants to come to an 8 o'clock class. I would have unannounced quizzes, which I had to put online because we couldn't do paper stuff anymore. And I made the mistake of clicking on the canvas saying that the quiz would be tomorrow. And so I would have a full class the days I had quizzes or tests, but people weren't coming to lecture. And I know that some people learn better online, but to me, there's something about a community of learners, that you're in the room with the professor, hearing the professor in real time, that makes a difference on how well you learn the material. And I saw, I mean, every year was different, but I felt like they weren't learning as much or as well subsequent to the pandemic. So, you know, there's certainly, also, as a biologist, there are certain jobs, you can't sit at home and do biology. I'm sorry, it's not gonna work. You have to be in a lab. So, that's the other thing that I found was interesting with the pandemic, is that for some people, switching to online remote work was not a big deal, but for other professions, it is a big deal. And some people had a hard time realizing that.
Well, I think it was important for me, and I know probably for others in here who like teaching and having a student to look at,
Of course.
is that you can see when your class is doing well, and you can also see when you're bombing. And I think you need that. I mean, the pandemic, of course, couldn't be helped, but now online has become the thing, and I understand in many ways why, because of jobs, and don't have to get up and do all this kind of stuff. But I still think students sitting together get to know each other, and that's how I think in the history department why we're losing majors is that there aren't students together talking to each other who they can get others involved, and they might become a major or something like that. So I think you need, I'm not really online, but it's here.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting how it progresses or evolves. Will it stay strictly online, or will it become a hybrid, or what it's going to be? And only time will tell. And I think it's important. And I'll use an analogy of the Army. So since 9/11, we had a totally different warfare. No more force on force. And 20 years where almost every member, senior up to major lieutenant colonel, had joined after 9/11. The rotations out to the National Training Center, the large force and force, that skill had been lost. And then they're trained up now, but it took a while, and they had to figure out and bring back a lot of the old timers who had done it to help interject that. And I think that's why the Emeritus College has great value, because a lot of the skills that will be lost are going to be needed. Another analogy would be is it the Missouri, USS Missouri? In Hawaii, they needed when they reactivated it in the 90s, President Bush reactivated it. They had to bring back sailors from World War II to figure out how to relight the engines, because they couldn't figure it out. So,
Well, wasn't that the problem with the DoD? They kept on canceling stuff because they didn't understand COBOL.
Or Fortran or something.
Fortran, they didn't understand the computer language that was developed in the early 90s that was still in use.
Early 90s, early 60s.
Early 60s for that? Okay.
That's why the problem is there are no programmers that learn it anymore.
Yeah.
well, there's also that great movie. Has anybody gone to the History and Hollywood series at the public library, where they bring a professor in from Fort Leavenworth, and they have a movie, and then they talk about the movie versus real history.
Oh.
But you remember Space Cowboys, I think it was?
Oh.
Or the premise of that, it's totally fiction.
Yeah.
Although, back to history, a funny vignette, they were interviewing an NFL player, and he was this has been like 3 years ago, and he said, yeah, I really enjoy Lord of the Rings and learning history. So it's,
Yeah, I used to tell students that when I taught Roman history, and they would say, yeah, I really want to take this course because I love the movie Gladiator.
Which was such bad history, because I taught ancient Rome.
yeah, great TV, but yeah, yes. So, yes, it's funny talking to my friends from Great Britain, and the Rat Patrol. Does anybody remember that series?
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Was tremendously popular in the United States, but nobody watched it over in Great Britain anywhere because it's absolutely not true. But history is so important, and it's also, your group is so important because your skills, knowledge, and experiences are invaluable, and your leadership is going to be, or is needed today, whether it's in a volunteer organization, whether it's here, or it's helping out the professors. Kind of like a biology experiment. I had a friend, her experiment took 7 years for a master's degree. It's like, why would you do that?
Well, my dad, he did space physics, and when I was a senior in high school, the summer before my senior year, he spent the entire summer at our dining room table writing a proposal to send to NASA. And he got this experiment that was gonna go up on this satellite. It was supposed to have gone up in 1986, and then Challenger exploded. And so it didn't go up until 1990. It was a experiment to study the poles of the sun, and to get the satellite to the poles of the sun, they had to go to Jupiter first, to use the gravity of Jupiter to fling the satellite out of the plane of the ecliptic. So he finally started getting data from this experiment in like 1994. I mean, nearly 20 years since he first envisioned it. So that was always something I kept in mind with my research, was that, yeah, sometimes things can take a long time. You just have to be patient and think and, you know, plan for contingencies, because you never know what's going to, and once you, certainly with his work, once it got shot up into space, he couldn't fix anything. He had to think about how to prepare that experiment so that it would work the first time.
That's interesting. Thanks for sharing that.
Like the Voyagers that are still talking back to us
Yeah.
from the
Yeah.
Kuiper Belt.
Well, you mentioned some, the Fortran or something. I was visiting my sister last week, and she was reminding me that there was a spacecraft that my dad had done back in the, I think, late 60s, early 70s, that they were able to have it fix it, talk to it so that it went by a meteor. And then they were trying to figure, they were gonna get data back, but they weren't sure if they could get data back because of the programming. And they couldn't, so this person contacted my sister to ask my dad, and he's like, I don't remember. Thankfully for everybody, the satellite was smart and it could talk without anybody having to figure out how to make it work.
Did you have something?
Oh, yeah, I was, the whole business of control of it is interesting in terms of family history, it's a very unique one. But my father was an engineer. World War II came, he was frozen on his job, and he spent the whole time drawing blueprints for airplane parts, which had, I guess, the advantage of the fact that he could stand outside and hear a plane go over and tell you what it was. But his older brother, because of him, was Schweizerdeutsch, was put in the OSS, and we'll never know what he did.
There's some great books. In fact, I'm reading Legacy of the Ashes again, about the CIA, which gained its origin from OSS. So. Well, any other comments or thoughts?
So getting back to the whole idea of a historian laureate, like a poet laureate.
Oh, I want them higher than that, but yes. A cabinet position with the department.
So one of the
Vice President.
One of the problems, so here's an example. Newt Gingrich has a PhD in history. He's a terrible historian.
Yes.
He really is. He's an appallingly bad historian. And so, sort of like, with the joke about medical school, what do you call the person who graduates last in his class?
A doctor.
Doctor. The thing is that history isn't about what happened in the past. It's interpretations of sources that are available that change over time in terms of what becomes available or how they're interpreted. And the interpretation of those sources is how particular historians develop their narratives and their critiques of what happened in the past. So the question is, how do you what kind of criteria do you develop in order to have an historian as a cabinet position who you can say, okay, they might be politically to the right or to the left, but what they're doing is genuine and not tendentious.
So, yeah, part of the office or the cabinet would have to be folks that think critically and creatively and review everything. Because who writes the history? Typically the winners. And we've all heard that. So it's truly understanding the history. And that's why historians, I think of historians, you have all different stovepipes.
Mm-hmm.
So, and all pulled together by wonderful librarians. The archivist.
Librarians is kind of.
Right, when you have the indexers and you have all the folks and you understand that and how you collect it. And so learning how to critically and creatively review history. And then that kind of takes you into analytics, both quantitative and qualitative. Qualitative being the numbers. Typically numbers don't lie, typically, when you're talking about accounting. And then the qualitative, when you're talking about words, that's where you have to look closely. And then you, as historians will tell us, you have to look at all sources. So newspapers are often a good source, or a source, sometimes good, sometimes not so good. Books, periodicals, and there's just so much. And the farther back you look, the easier it is to look at it and truly understand it. Because the moment it starts, the history, if you've experienced that history, you have the biases, you have your filters on it, and it's hard. And that's why we need historians, because I think historians do a really good job of being able to look at it and interpret it as fact versus fiction.
I think that's optimistic.
So, we have to start from a positive. You're gonna say something?
Everybody
No.
has
Okay.
their own context.
Sorry.
Okay, so, but it's a cross-functional team of folks looking at history and the cause and effect, and who's good at things and who hasn't been good at things. So, any other comments, questions?
Thank you.
Thank you.
My pleasure. I hope it was worthwhile.